So my name's Zach Kiehl again. I am the CEO and principal founder of a wonderful startup technology company called Vigilife. And I recognize that I'm a little bit of an outsider in this type of organization, right? So I do not come from the paving industry. I do not come from the construction sector. I have worked some manual labor my high school and college days, so I definitely know what it's like to pick up a shovel and get to work. But what I lack in industry expertise, I like to think I make up for from the perspective of technology. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but today we're going to talk about two things primarily. Kind of the state of technology in these industries, and then also specifically we're going to talk about heat stress. Before I get too far along with heat stress, and this is going to be a somewhat interactive presentation, so if that frustrates you, feel free to just head on out now. Believe me, I'm not going to make you do anything crazy. I'm curious, how many people in this room have either personally experienced or know somebody who's experienced a heat-related illness before? As I suspected, probably 80 to 90% plus. So I know in my limited time in this industry, it is a very germane problem. All right, without further ado, if you want to do this, normally I show live polls, but actually because we did it off a flash drive instead of my laptop, it's not going to show us the live poll, but this does. There's a little bit of a James Bond theme and game throughout our presentation, and I'll explain that in a bit. So this is always fun to do, and honestly, it helps me a little bit understand the demographic of my audience, right? So sometimes there's a lot of Sean Connery folks, folks that maybe grew up in that era versus folks like myself with Daniel Craig and Pierce Brosnan. So keep in mind and be ready to put your James Bond thinking caps on. All right, again, that was going to have an issue, so we're going to go right past that. So the agenda, quick intro, I already gave mostly myself. We're going to do a game. So I know safety can be a pretty dry topic, so we're going to try to make this fun and interactive. We are then going to focus on the problem of heat, talk a little bit about a pestle exercise, work through some potential solutions and case studies, and then close this out. So for the next 45 minutes, I aim to educate and engage. All right, so a little bit more about me. I am first and foremost a father and husband. I believe pretty strongly that almost all of us probably go to work for other folks, right? Whether those are spouses, children, families, etc. We all go to work for a reason, and for me, it's because of my children. I have 4 wonderful children and a beautiful wife. So father and husband first, tech company, CEO second. I am a biomedical engineer, as Richard mentioned. Well, that's a fancy way of saying you throw together mechanical engineering, electrical engineering with a little bit of biology, and you kind of get these people that are focused on developing technology to help people. I am an entrepreneur as well, and then I do a lot of youth sports coaching. I've coached over 500 kids in the last 5 years in the Dayton, Ohio area, which is where I come from. Apparently, I brought the cold weather with me. I left snow in Dayton. I came down expecting some nice sunny weather here in beautiful Columbia, and I got 40 degrees and drizzly. And then lastly, cue from James Bond. So a little bit of a quick story time. I was given a presentation in front of a pretty large audience one time. It was a unionized organization. They came in, they wanted to use some of our technology, and I immediately, I was pretty young. I still like to think I'm pretty young, but in this instance, I hadn't given a lot of these talks before, and I just started going super, super deep into the technology, and I could just see people's eyes kind of glaze over, like, what is he talking about? And then at the end, I told a story about how our story actually starts with the United States Department of Defense. So I have developed technology for some organizations that I can talk openly about and others that I can't. I do still have a top secret security clearance to this day, and I do have technology that's been put on Navy SEALs. So I'll leave it at that, but what I will say is I was talking about all of our technology one time, and then I told the story about how effectively someone once called me Q for James Bond. I'm not cool enough to be James Bond, not even close, but I am the nerd behind the scenes trying to make sure that these people can operate effectively and maintain peak human performance. And at the end of the presentation, the guy came up to me and he's like, son, he's a Southern gentleman. He's like, you should leave with James Bond next time. You should leave with Q. So it's a little bit of a fun story about how in my early days I actually kind of operated in that space where I was developing various types of augmented reality displays, wearable sensors with shirts built into them, exoskeletons, etc. So that's me as a person. All right, so I talked a little bit about this. This is our story. We actually started in confined spaces within the Department of Defense. So a lot of times I have to explain to people what a confined space is. I'm guessing most of you probably are aware in this industry. But this was the state of the art of our United States Air Force, our mighty Air Force with all of your taxpayer dollars. They would tie ropes around people's legs as they would crawl into these confined spaces. and the standby safety attendant would yank on the rope one time, and if the person yanked back one time, that meant they were fine. Two yanks meant they needed something, and incessant yanking, as you might imagine, meant something was wrong, right? So that was the state of the art of our Air Force with all the resources they have. And we partnered with Lockheed Martin and the organization I used to work at called Aptima for really this idea of like, well, why don't we leverage wearable technology? They were concerned about chemical exposure. They were concerned about heat stress and all sorts of challenges from working in these, in these fuel cells that are tight, dirty, damp, dangerous, etc. So we built them a connected solution that used wearable technology to maintain real-time health and safety awareness. So that's where our history starts as a company. All right, enough about me, enough about the company, a little bit into the game time, the interactive portion. So again, I'm not going to make you get up and exercise or any of those types of things. It's pretty easy. Before we do get into the game, my lawyers made me put this disclaimer up here that basically says that I do not own the James Bond franchise. I'm sure that's not a surprise. Otherwise, I'd probably be on a beach somewhere driving a Ferrari around. But suffice it to say, this is under the fair use. So we're using it for the purpose of education as opposed to commercial purposes. All right, so the ground rules. First and foremost, let's make this fun. Again, safety can be a fairly dry topic and also could be a bit morose or sad at times when we start talking about some of the incidents that folks have had in the industry. Second is, I'm going to be asking for a couple things. The first one, you can guess this part maybe to yourself. The second one, I will be asking for scale of 1 to 10. So some fingers in the air is really all the level of interaction I need. With 1 being, or you can even do a 0 being, hey, that is complete science fiction. I know that that's not a real technology, and then 10 being, hey, that's as real as it gets. We've got them on my job site. I've got 4 of them type of thing. So really trying to give us a spectrum or a scale of how real some of these technologies are. And then I'll have a few comments on maybe how we could use some of these technologies for health and safety. All right, we got it? Straightforward? Okay, first one, a jetpack for advanced mobility. What are we thinking here? Scale of 1 to 10. Let me see a couple fingers up in the air. Is this real technology? Okay, I see some 10s, I see some 8s, 7, 5. Okay, so we're saying more real than not is what I would say. So this one, I love this one because sometimes people start out with, oh yeah, that's a 10. And then I ask the question, how many of you are using jetpacks in your job site or at your facility? And then the answer is no. So again, think of this kind of as a commercialization readiness score of the technology. So I would say it's probably in the territory of more of 4 or 5. This type of jetpack does not currently exist, although this is actually the Royal Navy's kind of SEAL Team 6, so to speak. They've got these solutions that operate based off of thrusters on your arms. So in this specific instance, they're using it to actually board, like a hostile aircraft. So that individual kind of looks like Iron Man will take off. Of course, it's pretty limited range, battery life, all those types of things. But the technology is slowly coming along. So, I'm being a little facetious here, but potentially in the future we're elimination of ladders, right? If you need to climb up there, someone puts on a suit, they jump up. Again, some of these are meant to be a little funny, so feel free to chuckle, if not for my humor at a minimum. All right, exoskeletons for performance augmentation. What are we thinking? Scale of 1 to 10. 10, 8, 7, got a 4. A little divided 5. Okay, so kind of here, kind of there. This one I would say is actually a little bit closer. I have been on job sites where they're actively deploying exoskeletons. So there are technologies like this company called Exo. A lot of these are focused kind of on material handling, right? I'm sure many of you have felt the aches and pains of physical work, bending over, picking stuff up, etc. So there are some promising technologies coming along. The specific movie was Die Another Day. And then I love including this example because this is actually the Iron Man suit that I helped design and develop for the United States Army. Specifically SOCOM. They were trying to make basically a super soldier, with the use case being if you have to bust into a door where you know there are bad people, that person's going to be getting shot at, and they need someone that's strong, that's capable, that's protected, etc. Because of the weight of the body armor, it ended up getting so heavy they had to make it actuated. So generally speaking, and not to my fault, at least I'll say this to my grave, the program didn't really progress the way that they wanted to, but it developed some pretty cool technology nonetheless. So it's called the Talos program. The Iron Man suit of the Army. All right, smart or artificial blood? What are we thinking here? 5, 2, 4, 4, 2, 3. All right, pretty smart audience. So we're saying more fake than real. I agree. I'd probably give it a 2 or a 1. So the reality, and talking a little bit more about my story of why I chose to become a biomedical engineer, is that the human body is such a marvelous instrument. It's really impressive what the human body can do. And despite all of our advances in science and technology, there's a lot of things we haven't even come remotely close to replicating. So you can say, hey, are we divinely designed that way, evolution, et cetera? There's debates on that, but I will just suffice it to say the human body is a marvelous organism. So the answer is no, we do not have smart blood. There's a lot of research ongoing. They do have some blood substitutes, but we have yet to produce a blood substitute that can do all the things our blood can do, such as nutrient transfer, heat dissipation, carry oxygen around the body, et cetera. So we're a ways away from that, specifically in the James Bond scene of No Time to Die. He gets some artificial blood that actually has some artificial trackers in it, some nanobots, et cetera. So there are some interesting applications of this type of technology right now in academia. And for those of you that aren't that familiar with technology commercialization, generally what happens is you've got organizations like academia, so the smart people at the universities, organizations like the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which is called DARPA. They're the ones that actually invented the internet back in like 1960, and then here, 30 years later now, or 50 years later, now we all have it on our pocket, right? So a lot of times, sometimes these innovations will take 10, 20, 30 years or more to come to light. So this is one that we very well may see, in the coming years. All right, smartphones. There we go. Thank you. I was going to say, I put this one in to make sure people are paying attention. 10, right? So I'm seeing a few chuckles and a few smiles. But how many of you also remember maybe being, working when you didn't have a cell phone? For those of you maybe a little bit older in the audience. Yeah, I see a lot of hands pull. I'm even young enough. I went to school and went all the way through junior high and most of high school without a cell phone. And even then, I had the cell phone that when I wanted to, text someone the letter S, I had to press it 4 times. You had to be dedicated to that text message, right? So naturally, we laugh, but this is the reality, right? A lot of technology that we saw that was once science fiction is now commonplace solutions. So obviously this is a 10. I love the example of the fingerprint scanner up here. Obviously that looks a little different with some of the modern smartphones we see today that have folding screens and all sorts of unique technology. So they're in all sorts of movies, as you would expect, and really, from an occupational safety standpoint, what can't they do, right? They become an integrated part of our operations at most employers. All right, another phone with smart glasses, bionic eyes, some of these mini camera type solutions. What are we thinking? This is a little bit of a miscellany of kind of various ones, but maybe more focused kind of on the bionic eye type solution. What are we thinking? 10, 5, 7, 8, 6. I think I saw a 3. Pretty divided. Well, that makes sense because we're probably in that 5 or 6 territory. So again, these ratings are fairly subjective, so you could argue with me if you want. Please don't try to fight me. I'm not a big guy. I'll probably lose that one. What I will say, though, is there are some interesting technologies coming along. First and foremost, there are not bionic eyes. You know what a bionic eye is? It's just a glass eye that you put in and it has no functionality. So wear your PPE. Make sure you wear your safety glasses. If you lose an eye, biomedical engineers and science, we're not coming to save you, at least yet. The reality is, though, there are some interesting technologies in the space of things like augmented reality. Who here's heard of augmented reality before? Or virtual reality. So there's a little different. AR is more of the, wear some sort of display that shows something over the real world versus VR is kind of that complete immersive thing. So there have been some advances with Apple coming out with their AR headset. Google Glass was one of the first solutions. And there's even my colleague, a lot of times, he'll give this presentation as well. His name is Dr. Jeremy Ward, actually helped fund this solution when he worked at the Air Force Research Laboratory. This is the first augmented reality contact display, where about a year ago, their CEO sat on a stage much like this, except with thousands of people instead of 25. And he read his script from that contact lens. So pretty interesting technology that we could see come online. All right, homing beacons, GPS, ingestible sensors. What do you think? 10? All right, I agree. That one's pretty easy. They're in a lot of movies. Naturally, again, this is one of those things that who here remembers having to navigate around, with maps, right? I'm sure almost everyone, right? I remember my mom crying on the way to a select soccer game because she took a wrong turn from her MapQuest and couldn't figure out how to get there, right? Now we just pull out our GPS in our pockets because the military was working on it back in the 70s and 80s, and now it's commonplace. And I love to show this example too. This is actually the world's smallest GPS chipset. So we're down to a few millimeters of what a GPS can actually be nowadays. It's truly impressive technology. Smart or multifunction watches. 10, right? Another one of those like, oh yeah, 20 years ago, these were science fiction. There was no way you could pack that amount of functionality into a solution. I love this example because I think it's absolutely hilarious here. of whoever the writers were, for what it would envision to look like to receive a text message from a smartwatch in the James Bond series. They're like, spewing out some sort of metal spool with the message, report back to MI6. I thought that was pretty hilarious. A little off the mark there, but you can see them progress where naturally we have all sorts of interesting solutions nowadays that, really, what can't they do? I mean, applications for occupational health and safety, whether got lone workers that you want to keep track of, for heat illness, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Exposure assessment. This is actually a smartwatch we built for the United States Air Force that has a gas detector built into it. So instead of wearing those big clunky things, you can have one that actually clips to your smartwatch. All right, this one's a funny one. Avalanche airbags, or what I like to call smart PPE. What are we thinking? 10? 6? 5? It's all 1. Very good. A little divided here. I love this example. It's a little hilarious because the reality is I'd probably get a 7 or 8. 1, there actually is one. So if you're a big skier, they do have these little avalanche airbags that you pull the ripcord and they'll kind of try to keep you on top of the avalanche. But in the James Bond example, it's hilarious because he pulls the cord and he's basically got an entire tent. He has a female with him. They're having dinner, all those types of fun things. And the world is not enough. But I like this example because to me it talks about smart PPE, or what I think it'll eventually be known as personal protective technology. I think the reality is we're already starting to see some of these technologies be woven into what folks are already wearing, right? Your hard hat might not be a hard hat anymore. Maybe in the future we've got an AR display that can share specific information, right? Maybe we've got vests that have sensors built into them, right? Armbands, et cetera, that are collecting data and helping people do their job more efficiently and, of course, more safely. All right, we're almost done with these. QDAR, the ability to see through walls. This one's a pretty tough one. What are we thinking? 10? 5, 6, 3, I think I saw a 0 in the back there. All right, this one's probably in the 2 or 3 territory. So the reality is, and I have worked briefly on a system like this, specifically the military is actually trying to develop technology, and there's some academics. So here's an academic paper on the right, here's military trying to develop solutions that can do occupancy detection through walls. As you might imagine, it's really good to know if there's a goat inside a building or if there's 14 people with assault rifles, right? You kind of want to know that before you bust down the door. So in that aspect, we are starting to get good enough where we can actually put radar-based solutions that will look through the wall and be able to generally track to see if there are humanoid-type things walking around behind it. So that part is real, and that's why it's not a 0. The reason it's a 0 is you've actually watched the latest movie, No Time to Die, and I won't have any spoilers, but James Bond gets out of the water and he puts down this device that's about the size of a traffic cone, and it maps out like a 5-mile facility of every nook and cranny, and Kiehl puts on his headset and they can guide him through the whole thing. Absolutely fictitious. So we got a ways to go before we get to that level of QDAR. All right, this one's a fun one. Robots with advanced sensors, specifically e-nose capabilities, being able to sense with your nose. What are our thoughts here? 5, 7, 10, 4. So I think these are more real than not. How many of you have ever used a drone for any of your work? There you go. So that's some of that technology 10 or 15 years ago wasn't going to happen. Now we're starting to see it come online. I include this example because, one, I do think drones are very promising technology that we'll continue to see proliferate throughout the industry. But then also I want to point out that for about 20 years, DARPA, again, there's that agency, and I've done a little work with DARPA, has been trying to make an artificial nose, basically to be able to put the capabilities of like a dog onto a robot. The robotic dog, which is known as Spot, for bomb sniffing, narcotic detection, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, et cetera. There's a lot of application. But guess what? Generally speaking, they're just now getting to the capability of the human nose, let alone our canine companions. So the reality is, again, those biological systems, there's some really interesting work where they're actually even trying to use antenna from moths. It's kind of sad, they kill the moths even though they only live for like 7 days, and they take their antennas while they're live and they attach them to a little drone, kind of think of a quadcopter, and actually use the biologics from a antenna of a moth to do detection on a robot. So again, we're starting to see some of those types of things fuse on some technology that I think we'll continue to see online. All right, last one here. My favorite scene, implantable or wearable sensors for monitoring. What are we thinking here? 10, 5, 7. Okay, seeing a lot of 2 hands, so more real than not. I would generally agree. I think we're in a 7 or 8. If you've actually seen this scene, it's in Casino Royale. James is at the casino table. He's poisoned. All of a sudden he starts feeling it. He stumbles to the bathroom, basically takes out this device, shoves it in, presses a button, and then instantly his vitals are streaming back to MI6. So the reality is, I don't want to get too technical, but just shoving that thing in there, like you got to have a way to kind of relay the signal, and Bluetooth doesn't go through the body very well. So generally speaking, we do have implantable sensors. My colleague Jeremy, the guy I mentioned, actually has 2 in his body. He participated in a clinical trial for tissue oxygenation sensors that they were using for jet pilots. So think of it like kind of a contact lens type material that once you put a UV light over it, it would change its color based on tissue oxygenation. So those sensors are coming online, but the ability to just stream that GPS, all that data, without some sort of gateway solution like a cell phone is a little dramatized, I should say. Having said that, this is a pretty close example to what our company does, and we'll talk a little bit more about that from the application of heat stress. So now I'm transitioning. We're about halfway through, so hopefully you enjoy that game time, got your minds kind of thinking about, yeah, the reality is technology is changing, and what was science fiction 10 or 20 years ago now has sometimes become commonplace for us, and what might we see in the next 10 or 20 years that could revolutionize our industry. So here's my, I guess, thoughts on some potential opportunities here. So I mentioned robots and drones. I think some of this is probably overblown, but I do think there are some things robots and drones do really well. I think still they generally lack the creativity that humans have. And the moment where I'm driving down I-75, from Ohio down to, spend a lot of time in Tennessee, and I'm seeing Elon Musk's robots shoveling the pavement around, then that'd be great. But I think we're a little ways away from that. But I do think robots and drones have a lot of potential. I'm sure all of you have heard of AI. Some of the capabilities are overblown. How many have maybe used AI? All of you probably have, whether you recognize it or not, but maybe something like ChatGPT in the last 6 months. Any of you been experimenting around with that? Pretty cool, right? So there are applications. There's things like computer vision is actually what this example is showing. So computer vision is a fancy term for a camera that has live video and intelligence on top of it. So in this specific example, think of a camera on a job site that could actually determine if somebody's wearing their PPE or not. A little creepy, but also kind of cool, right? If you wanted to look at like real-time compliance and how many folks are wearing their hard hat, right? So big data, AI, ML, machine learning is going to be huge. Exoskeletons we talked a little bit about, augmented reality and virtual reality. I think we're a little ways away. Apple made a huge deal about their new Apple Vision, solution, but it's only got like 4 hours of battery life. And if you try to do it outdoors, then it struggles in the sunlight, and it's kind of bulky still. Like we're still a little ways away before we'll start to see that come online. Wearables, I think we've seen that explosion. I think that's one technology. I'm clearly a little biased as a CEO of a company that uses wearables, but I think we really start to see those go from kind of clunky to just pervasive, commonplace in our everyday lives, and I think they're in prime position to be used at work. And then lastly, we're seeing a thing, of course, GPS, dash cams, cabin cams. Again, there's some privacy implications here, but a lot of interesting applications through some of these technologies. So, how many of you have worked at an employer that's considered the use of wearable technologies for wellness, safety applications? Anyone? One? Okay. Very good. So normally I'd say it's about 10 to 20% of the audience. Sometimes I give these talks to a much larger audience, and I'd say it's about 10 to 20%. The statistics from some of the recent polls back me up. About 10 to 20% are actively using them, have been piloted or experimented with them or rolled them out to the enterprise, and about 50 to 60% are actively evaluating them. So again, this is one of these technologies that I think is kind of on the precipice of starting to become a real thing. There are some key considerations here. I'm not going to go through every single one of these bullet points due to time, but maybe look at some of the headings, looking at governance. What types of devices will be allowed on the network? What can they use and what are we going to forbid them from using? Data privacy is probably the biggest one. As somebody who is trying to sell these solutions to these markets, I would say this is the primary obstacle. And despite being biased, I completely agree. I think first and foremost, I love technology, but I think there have to be safeguards put in place to make sure that people aren't appropriately or unfairly penalized, right? Yes, it's cool if we can start to assess someone's health and safety, but what if it starts to get into their performance, right? Are we going to be able to see that this worker produces more and that this person's more fit for duty than this person for a job? Naturally, you get into some issues there. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we address that, but data privacy is a huge one. Security. The U.S. military got in big trouble because there was a general who was running around with Strava. He had a wearable that was linked to a Strava application and actually had a nice GPS heat map of the outside of a base that wasn't previously known, that I believe it was Russia had hacked into, and basically had a map thanks to this, this officer's Fitbit, so to speak. So definitely some security implications to work through as well. And then things like network and infrastructure. So as more machine learning, artificial intelligence, more devices come online, that sometimes can be unwieldy for organizations to manage. All right, so the summary here is that really I think this combination of big data, artificial intelligence, safety, it has tremendous potential, but I do think there are some things to kind of consider both on the pros and the cons, and certainly there's not a one-size-fits-all model. All right, so now we are going to transition a little bit to heat. So I know the talk of my talk here was on heat stress. So wanted to kind of set the stage with technology leading into heat stress, and then again, we started off, for those of you that joined a little bit late, of we asked what percentage of folks either had personally experienced or know somebody who's experienced a heat-related illness. And we had about 90% of the audience raise their hand. So I am new to the industry, as I mentioned, but I'm very confident. We do have a few clients in this space. I've toured, kind of went a ride along with a paving crew before and just seen the environment, talked to a lot of end users, and it's hot. It's hard and important work, but it gets hot out there, right? Let alone the environment, and then you're laying down asphalt, no shade, et cetera. And it's a very critical industry, though, for our nation, right? So there's really no sweet spot. Yes, automation will continue to make the job easier, but I think for the time being, we're still going to have a lot of people that have to get exposed to, hard, laborious work on a day-to-day basis. So, problem of heat. My job here, I would say, is to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that heat is a problem that is impacting your workforce, whether you recognize it or not. And we'll talk about that, recognize it or not. Recognizing, of course, being more on the safety aspect of maybe companies that have been having some heat-related illnesses, God forbid, potentially even some fatalities. If you want to look at an example of a company, and I didn't mean to call them out too much, but if you look at UPS, they're probably the largest company that's having the most notable issues. I think they had 4 documented heat stress fatalities amongst their delivery drivers last summer. There's a big legal battle between the Teamsters, and maybe some of you saw that the Teamster drivers were going to be making a bunch of money, and that was basically because they said, well, if you can't give us air conditioning in our trucks, they held out their hands and said, you're going to pay us. It's effectively hazard pay. If I have to go deliver packages, there's a horror story of one of them where there was yay for technology, there was a Ring doorbell cam that actually saw a UPS worker pass out in someone's driveway. Fortunately, the owner saw it, was able to call 911, but unfortunately, the person ultimately died on their way to the hospital. So heat is a problem. You can see some of the statistics here that emphasize it, both from a safety standpoint, and then also this huge one right here, productivity. This has been demonstrated in a lab time and time and time again. When the temperature goes up, people's ability to perform physically and mentally is drastically reduced, up to 4% per every degree Celsius above 27 C, which is about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's not even that warm. You'll start to see performance degradations. And then the average cost, keep that number in mind, about $50,000 for a reportable injury. Fatalities, you start involving lawsuits. I've seen lawsuits getting into $10+ million of payouts to families. All right, so heat's a big issue. This one's interesting. I love America, but it's interesting in America, we like to politicize everything. So I'm not going to get into the whole, climate change versus, is it man-made? Is it, natural? I think the reality is it probably sits somewhere in the middle, but I am a scientist and engineer, and I don't argue with data. And the reality is, you can see this, it's wonderful visualization from NASA. And if you want to kind of skip to the chase, since we all have short attention spans nowadays, here's what it looks like on the left once that graphic is done producing itself and then it's flipped. There's the data. So this is the average worldwide temperature from 1880 to about present day. And I can see a pretty concerning trend. And the reality is most of the smart people with all the PhDs believe this trend is going to continue. So again, we don't want to sit there and debate, is it climate change, is this, is that. The reality is the world is warming. It has been for the last 100 years, and it's going to continue to do so. And it all doesn't sound like that big a deal, only 2 degrees. When we're talking a few degrees, that's where we actually see rises in sea level of a couple feet. So cities like Venice and New Orleans and some of those types of scenarios can get really bad really quick, just with a few degree increases in worldwide global temperature. So world is getting warmer, and it's a problem for business. One of the challenges with heat, though, is that it's not really recorded. So right now, a couple states have their own individual heat stress standards, but there's no federal standards. So the reality is companies aren't really mandated to track that unless it ends in some sort of reportable incident where there's some level of medical care, calling a squad, et cetera. So the data are drastically underreported. And there was an interesting article that came out through the Bureau of Labor Statistics that said they actually are estimating it is a top 3 workplace injury. And what's really interesting, if you look on the right side of this slide, is that there was a professor out at UCLA that did a study that looked at the number of total accidents, illnesses, fatalities that were unrelated to heat, just all the OSHA reports. And what he found is, across the board, when the temperature goes up, the number of accidents, illnesses, fatalities goes up. These aren't things just related to heat. This is across the board. This is your fatal four, your struck bys, your pins, your falls, etc. All of these go up. And the reason for that is humans don't perform well in the heat. So basically, they've kind of confirmed the obvious here that when folks are more likely to fall off a ladder when it's 100 degrees than when it's maybe 55 or 60. And how many of those types of incidences where maybe somebody fell perhaps had a heat illness that caused them to stumble, right? Was it really a fall or was it a heat illness, right? So there's a little bit of challenge in record keeping here, but suffice it to say, when the temperature goes up, the likelihood of incidences will go up as well. All right, so talking a little bit more, unsafe and unprotected levels of heat have both acute and chronic implementations. So I'm pretty certain everybody understands the acute, right? That one's pretty obvious. If you have somebody whose temperature gets too hot to the point of exertional heat stroke, they could collapse. That's a bad day for everyone. Somebody, unfortunately, by the time they collapse, there's typically only about a 30 minute to 1 hour window before you can actually provide that life-saving intervention. If any of you need advice, if somebody does do that, the best way to do it is to actually do a cold tub immersion. That is the most effective solution. Yeah, ice packs are good, but if you have it available, start dumping ice on that person. That may seem a little overkill, but believe me, it's not. There's all sorts of people that have actually died because someone was like, I think they're okay, let's just give them a drink of water and set them up. Your body will continue to heat up. For those of you that are smoked meat connoisseurs like myself, I know I'm in the South here, so I suspect there's quite a few. Your temperature of your meat can keep going up even after you're moved from the heat, right? Because you've got that internal heat. So that's basically what happens with the human body. So everyone's aware when you get to about, or most of you probably are, when you're up to about 39, 40 degrees Celsius is when you're about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. That is kind of the point of no return. You're probably going to have a heat-related illness. Exertional heat stroke, you're going to pass out, it's going to be a bad day. That's where folks can have fatalities. But leading up to that, there's actually several signs and symptoms and performance degradations that occur. So specifically, did you know you're less likely to be able to hear auditory cues even at body temperatures of about 99.5 to 100 degrees? That beep, from the machine that's coming, working backwards, when it gets warm out, you don't hear that as well. Exhaustion, of course, that's an obvious one. Motor control, the ability to manage your fingers and do fine, minute objects, button presses, etc. Mental cognition ability, right? Being able to think critically in some of these environments. You tell me, but this sounds like about every one of those is pretty important in the paving industry. So even before people are potentially going to collapse, and let's hope they never get that close, your job site could be at risk. So that's something to think about. What OSHA and what NIOSH recommend is trying to keep people under about 100.5 degrees or about 38.5 degrees Celsius. That is the body temp. That's where you go for a little morning run, you get your blood flowing, you're in pretty good shape. You're generally not going to see some of these longitudinal or acute issues. So again, most of you, I'm very confident, know that if you get too hot, you could collapse. That's a bad day. Maybe I taught you a little bit on some of the leading indicators leading up to that. And the reality, and most of you are probably aware of this as well, is that a lot of folks don't recognize that they're succumbing to a heat-related illness until it's too late. By the time they've, starting to get a little cognitively disoriented, they're forgetting to drink the fluids that they need to, it might be too late to intervene. But this one I'm pretty confident that I imagine most of you probably aren't familiar with, and that is of longitudinal health impacts. Longitudinal is the fancy scientific way of saying over the lifespan, long periods of time. So there's been some research that's really interesting coming out of Mesoamerica nonetheless. There's actually been about 40,000 people in the last decade that have died due to chronic kidney disease of what they call of non-traditional origin. So there's been some great researchers whom we've been blessed to work with that have actually went down and started to try to figure this out. They're like, hey, is it pesticides? Is it because they don't have good diet, quality of food? What is the ultimate reason for this? So the reality is it's due to heat. It's due to chronic exposure to occupational stressors such as heat. So this one talks a little bit more about what it looks like from the standpoint of occupational heat stress and how it's a pretty complicated problem. I'm happy to talk a little bit more with anybody who's interested on that, but it's a very individualized problem that is determined by the person's acclimatization, which is a fancy way of saying are they used to working in the heat or not. It's by environmental conditions, temperature, humidity, wind speed, sunlight exposure. It's the person's demographics, their height, their weight, their gender, all those types of things absolutely matter how they respond to the heat. But I wanted to go here, so don't forget that chronic kidney disease. So again, 40,000 people have died. And the interesting thing is, the average age of those people is about 34. So if you look at chronic kidney disease in the United States, it's like 74, right? So I think most of you have probably seen people on dialysis, and sometimes folks' kidneys kind of wear out towards the end of their life. This was not the case with these individuals. These individuals were people that are actually dying fairly young in life. Generally, they don't battle obesity in some of these areas as much as we do in the United States. So it wasn't like, okay, these people are out of shape and eating poor food. So they started crossing things off. And what they found is anywhere where there were periods of high heat, poor worker protections, and intense work, they saw early illness and early mortality associated with chronic kidney disease, specifically acute kidney injury. If you have too many acute kidney injuries, or what they call AKI, it will eventually get to the point of having chronic kidney disease, which is unfortunately irreversible. If that happens, you're pretty much at that point, you're going to go through the dialysis problem. And to give you an example of this, they actually had one person who came in, he was 18 years old, they were doing blood work on him, perfectly healthy individual, wasn't obese, started working in the sugarcane fields, is where they've seen a lot of this. Had multiple acute kidney injuries in his first year. By the second year, he'd actually been diagnosed with kidney disease, and because they don't have as good a dialysis in some of those regions as we do, that third year he had died. So 18, 3 years later, he actually died of chronic kidney disease due to occupational heat stress. So I'm going to pause on this slide because I'm pretty confident. How many of you have workers that work in high heat? Probably almost everyone. How many of you have workers that occasionally have to do pretty intense work in that high heat? Good amount of you. I'm going to go out on a limb and say most of you have pretty good protections in place. That's a little bit of a saving grace. But then also we found recently that this problem is exacerbated by things like energy drinks and nicotine use and abuse of NSAIDs. And I'm not here to criticize you if you enjoy coffee, energy drinks, those types of things. That's total, it's fine. But I do want to point out how many of you have probably have workers that are banging their third monster by 9 a.m. right, or got a coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other one at times. So the reality is what we've seen is when you have this three in the middle and then you're exacerbating the situation with some of these stimulants, all of those stimulants increase your body temperature. Unfortunately, the reality is a lot of these individuals ultimately are developing chronic kidney disease, and you may say, oh, well, that sounds like a third world problem, Zach. That's something you were talking about, Mesoamerica, those types of things. We've actually done some work with a leading construction company. I won't name them, but the press is out there if you want to look them up, and they found markers of acute kidney injury with individuals that were working in 85-degree heat on a construction job site in central United States, out kind of in like the Kansas area. So I'll let you guess here. What percent do you think of the workers? So we were actually doing blood analysis and urinalysis, which is the fancy term for collecting their pee and analyzing the specific gravity of it. What percentage of the workforce do you think showed up dehydrated, knowing that they had to go work in 85 to 90 degree heat that day? Let's hear some answers. 80, 90, 50. Yeah, it was about 58%. So these are 58% of the people knew that they were going to go work for 10 hours in the middle of the heat, showed up dehydrated, and about 5% of the workforce actually showed up with a rating that would have been clinically dehydrated. That is to say, instead of going to the job site, they probably should have turned around and went to the clinic and got an IV because they were that dehydrated from the day before. So the reality is, I think this is a problem that's going to be growing in our country with the warming temperatures, and unless we can get ahead of it and really provide proactive kind of solutions to make people aware, try to improve their health, their safety, their wellness, et cetera, how many of those folks are having to retire early because they're struggling, right? How many folks maybe only enjoy 5 to 10 years of retirement before their kidneys give out? And a lot of times we just kind of say, oh yeah, he lived a good life and it was a hard job, right? The reality is there's some data now supporting this, that the more that we start to look, anywhere where we're seeing high heat, intense work, poor protections, and especially if there's this going on, there typically is acute markers of kidney injury. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of the kidney's jobs, if you're not familiar with your anatomy and physiology, is to filter your blood. And when you're dehydrated, they really struggle to do that well. All right, so this one, we're going to provide these slides, so I won't go into too much detail here since we only have about 5 to 10 minutes left, but this is called a pestle exercise, so it's a tool that they use in corporate America, and you'll see in a lot of MBA programs. So I think the problem of heat is really interesting to look at from the standpoint of this pestle exercise. So what that stands for is political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental. And all of these factors have a pretty interesting impact on heat on the job, right? Again, there's changing administration. There's been conversations about the new OSHA standard, those types of things. There's economic impacts. We talked about some of the costs associated with heat-related illnesses if somebody actually requires medical care. We haven't talked too much about the productivity element. Again, I said whether you recognize it or not. Remember that? A lot of you have probably done a pretty good job trying to eliminate heat-related illnesses within your occupation, but that whole productivity element, you might just be dealing with it of, oh, it's too hot to work, we're going to change our schedule, that's the reality, we just kind of got to deal with it. Labor costs are king in this industry. There's a lot to be said on that economic from the productivity standpoint. Social aspects, privacy we talked about, where technology plays, legal aspects, environment, etc. How many of you are familiar that there is a OSHA federal heat standard that's been drafted and proposed? Show of hands. About half, maybe a little less than half. So if you're not, it actually came out under the Biden administration. I won't get too political, but the reality is there's kind of a debate. Some people think that with the incoming administration, President Trump, that obviously, generally speaking, Republican administrations aren't fan of new regulation. Having said that, it's been really interesting that President O'Brien, who was actually the president of the Teamsters Union, spoke at the Republican National Convention, and for the first time ever, the Teamsters, which remember is the same group that supports UPS, actually voted in favor of President Trump. So, and his new Secretary of Labor nomination is actually somebody that has a pretty strong union background. So there's a little bit of debate, is like, hey, is the standard going to get killed? Is it just going to get drug out? Is it going to get pulled back a little bit? There's going to be guidance issued. No one's really 100% certain at this point, but suffice it to say there is a federal standard that is out, and it's in stage 6. I think actually as of last week, maybe it progressed to step 7 of 8 before it becomes a law. So what is in that standard? Well, all covered employees. So anybody that has employees potentially exposed to heat, this is applicable to. So I suspect that's every single one of you. At 80 degrees Fahrenheit, that's that initial heat trigger, you have to do these additional things. And I'll let you kind of read through each of these, but provide drinking water, break area. A lot of these are pretty common sense, right? Above 90 degrees, which I suspect is the majority of the summer here, you have to do these additional things. Mandatory rest breaks of 15 minutes every 2 hours. Supervisory or buddy system to observe for signs and symptoms of heat illness. Hazard alerting. Effective means of communication with employees. To me, and I'm biased, I think this points to the need for potentially technology-enabled solutions to help make this not so onerous on a business, right? It'd be pretty difficult to mandate some of these types of things and have to have a supervisor on every job site, that buddy system in place. So again, this will probably be relaxed a bit, would be my professional opinion, but the reality is it's out there. This is what it looks like. It applies to every employer that has people potentially at risk of heat. All right, so I'm biased, but I think it pays to be proactive. I mean, I've talked to definitely hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses from UPS, Amazon, huge companies, down to mom and pop shops of 10 people. And the reality is, it pays to be proactive. If you don't, things can happen. So here's some examples. Don't take it from me. I'm not biased here. So Baltimore's being sued right now because there was a sanitation worker death. Because a lot of times, people are like, oh, well, I'm in the northern part of the region. I know South Carolina's pretty south, but the heat's not going to impact us. 60% of heat-related illnesses actually occur in the first week of someone's employment, or when they return back from like vacation or something, when they're unacclimated again. Or a lot of them are actually occurring in some of these areas where it's not sustained warmth throughout the year. It's like, hey, such and such place has a heat wave. A lot of workers are exposed. That's actually what happened in Baltimore. Here's an example from Delta. Delta is a non-unionized organization that is getting ready to probably be a unionized organization. And one of their principal issues is, you guessed it, heat. They actually have workers that are installing sensors into their bump caps that Delta started to mandate, because the workers are saying, hey, this bump cap is making me even hotter, and I'm working on the tarmac in Atlanta in the middle of the summer, and I'm struggling, right? UPS, again, I don't want to... and they have made some good investments. Kudos to them. They have promised they're going to get air conditioning into the vehicles and those types of things. So they're I don't want to skewer them too badly. But here's an example of what happened. Workers posting on Facebook, taking pictures with their infrared thermometer, in the back of their UPS truck saying, look how hot it is. My employer doesn't care about me, right? Picketing, all these sorts of things. So I think the reality is you don't want to let it get this bad, right? Let's put preventative solutions in place, not just because you're doing the right thing and taking care of your people, but even from that productivity element. It literally pays to be proactive. Getting solutions in place can help your organization be healthier, safer, and more productive. All right, so I'm not here to sell my solution, but I'll talk a little bit about it just for awareness. So, Safeguard, we kind of call it like a check engine light for workers. So what we're trying to do is really make an easy button for that OSHA heat stress standard while also helping employees be more aware and proactive with respect to their health. Health, safety, wellness, productivity, they're all interlinked, right? You can't sit there and be safe on the job if you're going and party until 4 a.m. and you show up with 2 hours of sleep. I'll fight until I'm blue in the face on that one, right? Like it is a holistic journey that you want people to take good care of themselves, get adequate sleep, have a good diet, those types of things. Everybody knows this, but the reality is a lot of folks don't have the ability to do it or choose not to. All right, we talked a little bit about data privacy spectrum. I won't talk about too much about this, but what I will say is, we view it as a spectrum on the left. You can actually deploy our solution so that there's only invisibility to the employees themselves. If you wanted no awareness of the employer to have any of the data, we can do that. You could actually deploy it so that employees just have self-awareness. If we had more time, I'd show you a video. We were actually on the Today Show with one worker who said he lost 40 pounds, and our system changed his life because he recognized, again, when he was dipping, drinking his monsters, et cetera, carrying a little extra weight, he was struggling to work in the heat. And he ended up having an underlying heart condition that he found because of some of the proactive actions that he had taken and said, hey, I didn't realize I was really struggling as much as I am on some of these job sites. And on the right, then we have that ability if we want to share the data anonymously with the employer, if there's step count challenges, those types of things to really try to incentivize some of the users for healthy behavior. An ability to be flexible in what gets shared. So we call it a privacy handshake that both the employee has to extend what they're willing to share. Hey, I'll give you this data, but not this data. And then the employer also has to be willing to do that. What they shake on in the middle is what they share. Maybe they're cool with sharing step count and their aggregated, a group level core body temperature, but they don't want to see individualized data. So we've got some flexibility in place for that. Countless use cases. We're talking about heat today, but wearables can be used for all sorts of applications: lone work, confined space, industrial hygiene, wellness, accountability, emergency response, etc. I'm almost out of time here. I did want to end on a couple case studies. This one's a great one with Rogers O'Brien Construction. They had several heat-related illnesses the prior year. They implemented some wearable technology in partnership with us and eliminated those down to zero. They actually had one of their subcontractors come on board who did an A/B comparison with one of their concrete subs, and they had 20 people on the system, 20 people off the system, and they only ran it for 2 weeks. Group that did not have the wearables on had 2 heat-related illnesses that required medical care. The group that did had 0. So we've seen a lot of success. As far as what that can look like, here's an example. So here's when actually somebody gets an alert that goes to just themselves. This is their core body temperature on the y-axis, and on the x-axis they have the time. So say what you want about the technology, but in my opinion, you can't argue with the efficacy or how effective the technology was. As soon as that person got an alert that they had entered an unsafe kind of level, they took some sort of proactive action. I don't know what this worker did. They probably went to a job trailer, maybe to a truck, et cetera, got some air conditioning, some cold water, et cetera. All right, this one's fun. Boeing, NASA, $6 billion program. So for those of you that are feeling bad because maybe you're still in the Stone Age and you're like, well, this sounds cool, but it sounds a little too complex for us. This is a $6 billion program between Boeing and NASA focused on a reusable space capsule going to the International Space Station. So the reason I love this example is, see these guys in the hazmat suits over here? On the $6 billion program, current state of the art was to pay a flight doctor to stand there with binoculars from over 1,000 feet away for safety reasons with off-gassing, and stand there with binoculars and a clipboard and observe for signs of heat illness. Now you tell me how easy it'd be to observe for signs of heat illness when someone is in a hazmat suit from over 1,000 feet away with binoculars. They did have a heat-related illness. Thankfully, it wasn't a fatality. And ultimately, they said, hey, we got to do better than this. So they ended up partnering with us, and we have the ability to now remotely do that, monitor. They actually even have a terminal up where they can see it at NASA, like in Johnson, where they can see the live core body temperatures of some of these workers through the use of our technology. I'll even call it this example here. One person had to get pulled out. Turns out they were sick. We kept seeing them trip some initial alarms, and they ended up talking to him. He's like, yeah. He's like, I wanted to be with the team because, again, I've heard that common refrain. Right? I didn't want to let the team down. Didn't want to let someone down. He ultimately probably would have been heat casualty had he continued. So we were able to pull him out and make sure he got the treatment he needed. Last one I'll cover, since I'm pretty much out of time here, going back to the use case with chronic kidney disease. So don't want to leave it on a sad note because we are making an impact there, and we're pretty proud of this since this is some humanitarian work. I know some of this is Mesoamerican at sugarcane fields, it's not necessarily paving, but I would bet if we go out and actually do some sampling, we could probably see maybe slightly similar, probably not as severe results, but I bet there's some kidney injuries happening on the job there. So this slide is a little bit of a mouthful, a lot of data on it, but what I really want to unpack is, first and foremost, we've reduced the incidence rate of kidney injury from about 21% down to less than 1% through the implementation of two things. First is common sense practices. As much as I love technology, and I want to say all of you need our technology, the reality is you can get pretty far with common sense, being rest, shade, hydration, right? Sanitation stations. There was a lot of females that were actually doing some of the sugarcane cutting, and they would purposely tactically dehydrate because they didn't want to pee in the field in front of other people. I get it, right? So they would not drink enough water. So, right, some of these common sense practices. And then the second one is actually we implemented our technology to basically say, hey, right now they're on a 45 minutes work to 15-minute rest ratio. And they would also use our technology that if they got too high, their body temperatures got too high, we would tell them to take a break, outside of that cycle. So you may be thinking, and what they thought initially was, oh, well, that's going to cut into our productivity. And what's really interesting about this use case, these workers were actually paid piecemeal. So what that means is they were paid for the amount of sugarcane cut that they cut, all right? And a lot of times it's a patriarchal society. They had kids at home, they had a wife at home, and it said, here, go take your machete and cut as much as you can in an 8-hour period. Do you think the men were taking good breaks? The men in the room? Or would you just kind of work as hard as you possibly could to max it out every dollar you possibly could for your family? That's what they were doing, and it was literally killing them. Okay? So they weren't real happy when they first said, what do you mean I got to take a 15-minute break? I can't do that. You're going to cut into my pay. Pay piecemeal, right? The reality is, over the course of about 7 or 8 years, we actually saw their hourly sugarcane cut per hour almost double, and their workday went from an 8-hour day to about a 4.7-hour day. And so they've seen increased productivity. They've seen the incident rate go from 21% down to 1%. So I know that this is a little bit different industry, but I think it's a beautiful use case because it's so simple. They don't have complicated machinery down there. Person and a machete working in the heat. It's kind of it sounds bad, but the ideal science experiment of, okay, well, what if we are proactive? What can we do to really improve that? So we've been able to see increased productivity. The workers love it. The business loves it. And of course, more families that aren't broken up by having their primary breadwinner unfortunately pass away. So anyways, I'm pretty much out of time here. I could talk more on some of these slides. These slides will be available. I do think these industries are starting to converge around wearables, Internet of Things, regulatory and insurance. We're doing some interesting partnerships in the insurance space to try to make sure it makes financial sense as well. But I'll end on this slide. So, warming world, the time is now. The time to act is now, excuse me. You can see some of the rallying that's ongoing, some of the OSHA standards that are coming out, and then from the emotional standpoint as well. I've known some personal families have people reach out and told the stories of losing members of their family due to heat. So, it may sound, oh, it'll never happen to us. The reality is it can. It takes one bad day. Someone shows up a little drunk, a little hungover from a fun weekend wedding or something, comes to work sick because they got COVID Monday morning. You never know when that heat-related illness can strike your business, which will have a financial impact, of course, but also on the lives of others. And with that said, thank you for your time and attention. Happy to continue the conversation. I do have a booth. Wanted to thank Richie again. Thank Cliff. Thank you all for being here. It's been such an honor to talk to you about technology. Hopefully it's fun, engaging. Hopefully you learned something, and I'd love to continue the conversation. Thanks again.